Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I'm going to be discussing and reviewing the absolutely essential treasure of a book of film scholarship, a book about the making, the unmaking, and frankly, the butchering of what should have been a classic film that then became an obscure footnote in the world of Orson Welles and the Mercury Group at RKO. And that's, of course, Mark Edlitz's new volume entitled Maverick and the Machine, Orson Welles and the Battle Over Journey into Fear. Now, of course, people will be familiar with Citizen Kane and Orson Welles at RKO, and they may even know of the famous butchering of the Magnificent Ambersons, one of the greatest films ever made alongside Kane that we have never been able to see in its original form, as the studio famously took over the film, recut it, instituted new reshoots, stuck on an ill-fitting attempt at a happy ending, and cut what was over 130 minutes down to an 88-minute release version, making the original version of the film that Welles made the holy grail among all of us film nerds, and I think every single one of us still dreams of finding the original version of Ambersons. I certainly do. For me, it is the holy grail of all archivaldom and film preservation. However, there was a third film that the Mercury Group made at RKO. It was the one not directed by Orson Welles, but still produced and co-written and starring Welles, and has all the hallmarks of the Mercury unit. And this was Journey into Fear, which was directed by Norman Foster, and it was an attempt at making something at least a little bit more commercially minded, and proof that the Mercury unit could make a film that struck a chord and was successful with audiences. It is based on the 1940 Eric Ambler thriller of the same name about the munitions expert Howard Graham, who is overseas in Turkey and completed helping the Turkish government and needs to just go back home. But it quickly becomes apparent after an attempt is made on his life that German forces in town don't want him reaching home, as it's pointed out to Howard Graham that if he were to be killed, even if someone else could replace him, which of course they could, it would take some time for them to get back up to speed and get several projects going again. There would be a certain time where things wouldn't be in working operation, and it would offset Turkish forces, allowing the Germans to basically continue or have a little bit of a wiggle room, as it were, to do what they wanted. So that is why Howard Graham is targeted for assassination and is then placed by the Turkish secret police on a small tramp steamer to journey back towards England instead of taking the train he planned on, as if he took his train that he had a ticket for, he would probably not make it over the border before he was killed. He is placed on this tramp steamer with a variety of colorful characters, any one of whom could actually be a German agent in disguise, and halfway through the journey, the boat stops to take on an additional passenger, who just so happens to be the assassin Banat who tried to kill Graham before. So the film is a espionage thriller. It is a wrong man scenario, which makes it ideally suited for a Hitchcock film. In fact, the film was thought of as perhaps being a good vehicle for Hitchcock, who was working at RKO at the time, but eventually the Mercury unit were the ones who seized upon the rights after Ben Hecht had tried to adapt it himself. He had bought the rights to the novel and eventually just passed it on to RKO, who bought it, and it was to be the third of the Mercury films, and the one of the three that was most geared towards a commercial market. It should be understood that the Mercury Group was supposed to make a series of films, and we at least got 3 of them, but Journey into Fear has been unavailable for a great number of decades. It's only seen a handful of physical media releases, and the sheer lack of availability have made it more obscure. but also a number of urban legends sprang up around it. Many have claimed that Orson Welles himself sort of ghost directed the film or partially directed the film, and so that has led to even some saying that the good parts of the film are the Welles sections, and the bad or more mediocre parts of the film are the work of credited director Norman Foster, which is complete nonsense. And basically, the film has been shrouded in mystery because no one's ever delved into its production and the aftermath of the intensive series of constant editing and re-editing and back and forth between studio and the Mercury unit. And all of this being further complicated because the film was made not after, but alongside the Magnificent Ambersons production, and RKO forced Mercury to group the budgets of both films together so they were always going to affect one another in how they performed or how they were looked at by the studio's front office. And on top of that, Welles had to go off to Brazil to work on the It's All True documentary, as he was asked to, as basically an official United States act of goodwill towards South America and the Good Neighbor policy as well, to hopefully secure their further support in the fight against the Axis forces. So there were many logistical problems involved in the production and post-production of Journey into Fear. Orson Welles found himself working on multiple projects and being stretched incredibly thin. So, of course, he did not direct Journey into Fear, which has also led some to not really pay it much attention because it wasn't directed by Welles. But it has his stamp and the Mercury stamp all over it because it's a Mercury production. And so the third of the just 3 Mercury films made at RKO should not just be considered a footnote to history and only get passing mention or a slight section in a Welles biography. Now, before this point, of course, both Kane and Ambersons have been written about and studied and analyzed time and time again. Notably, Robert Carringer wrote 2 classic reference works on Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons, but he nor anybody else ever wrote a book on the third film. So there was always this hole, this badly needed volume that we never got on Journey into Fear. We had the 2 great Carringer books on Kane and Ambersons, plus everything else and every biography and every book about the making of, also documentaries and featurettes and special features on physical media releases of those films, and the more and more news items that appear about efforts being made to find the lost version of Ambersons, or fans attempting to recreate the lost version of Ambersons using original script materials and animation efforts, and unfortunately an unbelievably misguided attempt that's being tinkered with to perhaps use AI to reconstruct someone's version of what they think the original Ambersons was like. But no one's ever really gone into Journey into Fear. Again, it's become a sort of footnote to the Orson Welles at RKO story, and very few people have heard of, let alone seen, what is actually the third of the 3 films. So Mark Edlitz's book, Maverick and the Machine, is really that third book volume we've always needed. It is the perfect companion piece to Robert Carringer's books on Kane and Ambersons, and I can think of no higher praise to give to a book that is focusing on a particular film in the Orson Welles canon, or the Mercury canon of the 3 films, because that's what this book truly is. This book is invaluable because it goes through the entire history of the development of Journey into Fear. It begins with Ambler's novel and it being eyed by various studios, right down to actually including and summarizing the original readers' reports of the studio employees whose job it was to read novels and source material and give their opinions on whether or not it would make for a good movie. And so we start with that and how the original rights were obtained by legendary screenwriter Ben Hecht, who tried to adapt it himself. Ultimately, he wound up moving on to other things, and the rights eventually got to RKO. So you get to learn the whole story of the genesis of the project to begin with, and then how eventually Orson Welles and the Mercury unit decided they were going to do this as their other project because they were looking for something that was a bit more commercially minded. They toyed with various projects like The Smiler with a Knife. They were thinking about perhaps doing a thriller, if not an out-and-out comedy thriller. And so Journey into Fear, having all these different elements and as a novel being extremely contemporary and fully evocative of other parts of the world and other cultures and having undercurrents of dark humor, all of this fit within Welles's and the Mercury unit's sensibilities. So it made perfect sense that they opted to adapt Journey into Fear as the third film. Edlitz's book goes through the entire production journey from the original Ben Hecht materials and how other writers came in and did some basic scenarios and wrote up the first basic treatments that Orson Welles started to work with, and how he worked with those writers and then eventually decided that things weren't really going where he wanted them to, and how those writers were eventually dismissed, and how it became a matter of actually Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten writing the screenplay themselves, and also the whole question over authorship and proper credits, because of course even the credits of who wrote the screenplay were eventually changed. So in the eventual release version, it is simply credited to a screenplay by Joseph Cotten from the novel by Eric Ambler, and Edlitz's book actually explains how that credit came to be, why it was changed from the original credits, why Welles's name was taken off the screenplay, and also underlines how, because of the collaborative nature of the Mercury unit, there were others involved in the development of the screenplay, and things were still in a state of flux during shooting, especially with the ending being something no one could quite agree on. So the book is divided into sections. The main bulk of it is about the production of the film, the actual shooting of the film on a day-by-day and week-by-week breakdown, so you can see the full journey of Journey into Fear, exactly how it was made and how things were going along, and how this played into Ambersons being finished, where Orson Welles was going, where and when he was off in Brazil, how they had to cram in all of his scenes as Colonel Hockey and adjust the schedule. So you get the whole production report of the film, and you're able to see how things were moving along, and also see where certain things started happening that were the signs of the studio sort of flexing their muscles. And eventually this leads into the post-production section, which is the most vital part of this book, because this is where you finally get the full documenting of exactly what was done to this film, how it was first assembled and previewed at about 100 minutes, what the test audiences thought, and Edlitz even includes samples of the original comment cards from the preview audiences, so you get to hear in their own words what they thought, and how the studio reacted to this, and they didn't react very well. So a lot of the challenging elements in Journey into Fear that were purposely there and reflective of the original novel, what attracted everyone to the property in the first place, that was the first thing to go. And the film underwent a incredible number of changes and re-edits and reshoots and inserts and changes to the soundtrack and redubbing of the soundtrack to appease the studio's concerns over what the various test audiences had reported on. And so over a series of edits and re-edits and new versions and new tweaks and editions prepared by the studio with and without Mercury involvement, and reflecting some of what the original production wanted to do, reflecting some of the changes and inserts and reshoots that director Norman Foster and Orson Welles wanted to do and would have done as part of a normal post-production process. They didn't get to have a normal post-production process. The whole thing basically got interrupted and taken over by the studio themselves, who were sort of throwing their weight around. And you can see how all of this stuff made this into an extraordinarily convoluted back and forth journey between two different sides, all the while showing that the Mercury unit was extraordinarily cooperative throughout all of this, particularly Welles himself, even though he was constantly off in Brazil, and it got to a point where they couldn't actually send film elements for him to look at, or they didn't want to, or they didn't want to pay to. So this book gets into the nitty-gritty of just how relationships broke down over time, and a lot of it was not really anyone in the production's fault. You can see how Welles himself was trying to appease the studio. He was trying to fix things that weren't necessarily broken, but also understanding where the studio was coming from. So the legends of Orson Welles had a fear of completion and was difficult to work with and had to have his own way and couldn't just make a normal movie, that's completely untrue, as Edlitz's book proves, and you get to see the accounting of the back and forth and how it got to a point where Welles actually would have to take out trade ads to, almost publicly shame RKO into actually trying to let them finish their own movie they weren't allowed to finish. And it was just a constant back and forth, and the film was stuck between the two parties and kept getting continually adjusted and torn apart and reshuffled. And so this explains why the film was eventually released in the baffling, at times incomprehensible 68-minute release version. And just think about that for a minute. Going from roughly 100 minutes in the first preview version, the version of the film they assembled, the version of the film that they had made, was 100 minutes. And the eventual release version that was paired on double bills and sent out across the country and worldwide, the primary release version was down to 68 minutes. And that includes some reshoots. That includes some of the changes that Welles requested and was practically begging RKO to do to the version that they had eventually made. And RKO did implement some of those, but not all of those. They basically just took a few and said, we'll do that, and we're stopping there. And if this is starting to sound familiar, it's basically what happened on Touch of Evil with the famous 58-page memo, but 15 years ahead of time. And what's heartbreaking reading this story and finally getting all of these details that have been so completely unavailable and just non-existent before this book, you can clearly see that not only is there a good movie inside of the unbelievably butchered 68-minute release version we've had all these years, but you can see that they tried to make a good movie. They did make a good movie. They just didn't get to finish it. And they still tried to appease the studio's concerns. They just were between a rock and a hard place. And the film basically got taken away and became a jumbled up mess of the original version that never got to get finished, the studio's ideas, the responses to the various tests, other editors and people coming in and working on the film and implementing their own changes, Mercury being allowed to make some changes of their own and do some of the reshoots they wanted and at least shoot a version of the ending that they wanted to use, and that was finally used in the release version. But then other things they did not being implemented, other changes they wanted or would have made or would have finessed not being implemented. So ultimately, this book explains exactly why what we got was a jumbled up, incomprehensible at times, but unbelievably fascinating 68-minute thing assembled from what was originally at least 100 minutes. And so it truly underlines why Journey into Fear is one of the most butchered, compromised films of all time. In its own small, unassuming way, Journey into Fear is as compromised and butchered. In fact, it's really more butchered in ways than Ambersons ever was, because at least in the 88-minute version, Ambersons still has a story that's maintained throughout. You can still follow along, not all that well throughout it, but you can follow along. The release edit of Journey into Fear, you can't claim that, because the first time anyone sees the film, myself included, it's quite baffling. And the changes that were implemented aren't just, removal of scenes and cutting down the runtime. No, the entire structure of the film was altered. The soundtrack was altered. Voiceover narration was partially implemented to be expository to cover up entire sequences that were removed, making the story incomprehensible. But the narration doesn't really work. It's evocative, yes, but it doesn't quite work, and it's only partial narration. Crucial pieces of the plot are just not in the film. Certain performances and characters are reduced to practically walk-ons. A lot of character motivations are not just confusing or not defined, they're not even there anymore because they have also been removed. Entire pieces of scenes are literally cut out of the film, or scenes prematurely fade. You see evidence all over the place of the original scenes or character actions or things that were there. So this is a film that should be used in film schools to teach editing and the destruction of a film, because if you start pulling at the thread of this film and you start looking at any of it closely, you can see that the release version is a patchwork nightmare of cut after edit, and it's in both picture and sound. Even the credits were changed, and even the ending was changed, of course. It is, without question, one of the most unbelievably compromised, butchered films in all of film history, and it needs to be understood for what it is, because it's just as bad off as the Magnificent Ambersons was. But because it wasn't directed by Orson Welles and it's been so unavailable for so long, it's become a footnote to the Orson Welles and RKO story, which is truly unfair because it is a very good film. And it's so fascinating to everyone who sees it because you can see the good film in there. You can marvel at Carl Struss's incredible photography that at times has all the visual stylings of Citizen Kane, because Orson Welles was, of course, involved in some of the camera setups and lighting. But everybody was. It wasn't just that Welles was only involved or only on the set on certain days and, did all this stuff himself and ghost directed a percentage of it. No, the Mercury unit was a fully collaborative effort. But in spite of having Wellesian flourishes throughout, the film is clearly the work of Norman Foster, who is the unsung hero of Journey into Fear. He truly was, I think, the best action-adventure and spy thriller director that classic Hollywood produced outside of Hitchcock coming to America. And that's because his calling card were the incredible Mr. Moto films made at Fox in the 1930s. It became the sister series to the Charlie Chan films that were incredibly popular, which Foster also directed some of those. But Foster was an actor first. He had traveled the world. He had a vast amount of different experiences, but he turned his hand to directing. But he was also a writer. He could also work in music, but on the Mr. Moto films that he made, starring Peter Lorre as the Japanese Secret Service agent, who was a master of disguise, a judo expert, and an assassin, those films are the work of a true auteur, because Foster not only directed them, but he wrote or co-wrote all of the ones that he made. Those films transport the viewer to another world. They're all set in foreign exotic locations, but they never once leave the actual studio backlot. They were made on incredibly tight schedules for very little amounts of money and were incredibly difficult to make. But all of the ones that Foster wrote and directed are really the best action spy thrillers that anyone made in classic Hollywood, at least in terms of the studio system. They were light years ahead of everyone else in the spy thriller genre. They're an incredible influence on everything that came afterwards. And his ability to do all this with limited resources and produce magic out of nothing made him the perfect person to direct Journey into Fear. So you've got Foster's style and his past experience making the Mr. Moto films driving Journey into Fear, which also has the Wellesian flourishes and all the DNA of the Mercury unit, because it was the third film of the Mercury unit at RKO. So you've got the classic players of the Mercury Theater. You've got Everett Sloane and Agnes Moorehead. You've got Joseph Cotten, who co-wrote the screenplay with Welles, but also Foster worked on the screenplay too. There was a feeling of camaraderie and everyone working towards the greater good. And that went as far as actually casting the producer of the film, Jack Moss, as the assassin Banat, and a wonderful touch that's at once absolutely hilarious, but on the other hand, it was absolutely perfect because Moss is incredible as Banat, who doesn't have any dialogue, but is a character who is, very believable. He's a smaller, more heavier set fellow. He wears glasses. He's a very inward, quiet character who is, on one hand, extremely ordinary looking, but on the other, menacing as hell. It's an incredible performance and made all the more striking when you realize that Welles actually cast the producer of the film as the assassin in the film, and it works beautifully. So Journey into Fear still has that wonderful can-do ragtag feeling of Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons, and it's a film that was made to sort of buck the system by having challenging elements that were a bit different, that were a bit out there, that actually reflected the cynical humor and, in some places, darkening worldview of the original source material of Ambler's novel. So one of the highlights of Edlitz's book is that he stresses that the myth about Journey into Fear being directed by Orson Welles is indeed a myth, because he couldn't have directed it, especially since for most of the production, he was not in the country. So, of course, he couldn't have actually directed the film. But as a fan of Norman Foster and his other works, and especially being somebody who thinks that he deserves a far greater reputation than he has, which is sadly, pretty much non-existent. It's not like you can read a bunch of articles about the auteur Norman Foster, because guess what? He was an auteur. He was a screenwriter, and he did write some of his own films, and he has a style that is throughout his filmography and his television work. I was truly happy to see Foster get vindication here in this book, and finally putting to rest the rumors that Journey into Fear was partially or completely directed by Orson Welles, and that Norman Foster was just the guy who got credited, or the guy responsible for the average stuff in the film, which there is no average stuff in Journey into Fear. What you do notice in the horrendously compromised release version is a patchwork of different people's hands getting on the film and tearing it in different ways. Now, a fan of Orson Welles and a fan of Kane and Ambersons who comes to Journey into Fear could find out about the basic gist of the story behind the film by reading the Wikipedia article and reading a bunch of books on Welles and Welles biographies. But that's been about all we've had in terms of information. Edlitz's book is digging into the minutiae and giving the reader the entire history of the journey of the film, and then it continues into the release and aftermath. And this is also really crucial because not only will you understand how the film got to be the 68-minute US release version at that point, but then you'll also understand the story of the alternative version that popped up in some European countries and still exists in, unfortunately, a very low-quality standard definition file that only turned up on select physical media releases, which itself, unfortunately, is not even at the correct speed. Now, this alternative version, which is typically labeled the European cut, was supposedly rediscovered in the 2000s, but again, it has existed in some form for a couple decades, but only on certain physical media releases in other territories. What this version is actually one of the previous edits RKO had made of the film. So it's actually a work in progress edit that is not quite the US 68-minute theatrical release version. So it doesn't have all of the changes in edit, picture, and sound that were made to that edition. So it shows where the film was at this particular point in its post-production history. So in some ways it could be compared to the preview cut of Touch of Evil, as that film has 3 versions in existence. Theatrical cut, preview version, that is an earlier alternate cut of the film, and of course the 1998 reconstruction attempt based on the 58-page memo. With Journey into Fear, this alternative version that was released and shown in some European countries runs about 70 to 71 minutes at its proper speed. This has a different edit of the film. It has scenes that are not present in the US version, so it's priceless for those. It doesn't have the voiceover narration. It has completely different credits. It does not have the striking placement of the introduction of Banat scene as the pre-credit sequence like the eventual US cut does, and it also has a completely different ending. This has a ending that's cobbled together out of the material shot for the climax of the film, and is an ending that the production did toy with, but no one was really happy with it as it doesn't really work. And when you see this version and you get to that ending, it's a definite rug pulling moment because it ends the film on an abrupt note. It's a really not great attempt at humor because it comes out of left field, and it's basically a scene that was not intended to be the ending of the film suddenly being made to end the film. So if you know the US theatrical version and you know that ending, going to this version, you get some really priceless materials that are not in the US cut, but some things are different, some things are missing, the edits are different, and while some things are better, the ending is a notable downgrade because it doesn't really work at all, and it is very jarring. But this is the version some audiences saw in Europe, and Edlitz's book actually tries to explain how this version got out and was put into circulation in other territories. There were some attempts to make some of Welles and Mercury's requested changes to prints that had already been made, but other prints of this earlier edit had already been sent around, or had already made it out, or it was deemed unimportant for all territories to have the finalized release version of the film, and that they could get away with sending out this earlier version. So there's a couple different scenarios, and Edlitz goes down the pathway of how all of these affected the overall releasing strategy of the film, and just how this alternate previous edit of the film, a working edit, actually made it out and was shown in some countries in Europe, and eventually found its way onto at least 2 physical media releases, which is the only way we have access to view this alternate cut of the film. Now, the 2 cuts being completely different edits means that you can't really mix them together. You can take some of the scenes exclusive to the European version and try to reinstate them into the US cut of the film, but that still is not the original shooting script version. Plus, they have different edits and different sound mixes, so it is a completely separate version of the film that needs to be properly preserved. And fascinatingly, Edlitz goes into a further section where he does a detailed comparison of the 2 versions, going through the major differences and what happens in each of the individual scenes where heavy editing took place, and also highlighting the usage of reshoots where camera setups and actors and everything was noticeably different as these were retaken at a later date. This also goes into more of how Joseph Cotton's vocal performance was completely redubbed and the tonality of his performance altered to try and appease the studio's concerns over the feelings of the first test audiences who thought the Howard Graham characterization was not heroic enough. So, of course, if you look closely at the film, you will notice that the vocal performance of Joseph Cotton doesn't always match the lip movements of the original takes, nor does the vocal performance necessarily match the tone of the physical performance you're seeing. Plus, it introduces more generational loss into the soundtrack, just like the generational loss you see all over the film, because even physically in both picture and sound, the film is a patchwork affair, just due to the tomfoolery that went on in its post-production. The book concludes with basically the aftermath and legacy of Journey into Fear, and where the careers of Welles and the rest of the Mercury players, but also Norman Foster, went after this point. Foster and Welles remained friends. Foster actually does appear in the famous unfinished film, The Other Side of the Wind, and Welles always insisted that he did not direct Journey into Fear, that it was Norman Foster's directorial efforts, and he tried his darndest to make sure that the urban legend that he ghost-directed the film did not go further. Now, part of the reason why Journey into Fear has become the sort of footnote to the Citizen Kane and Welles at RKO story it's become is simply because it has not been available on home video, or were in circulation all that much. There were a handful of editions in the 1980s in the home video boom. There was an 80s VHS and beta release, sort of looking like an official RKO release, but still supposedly being the 68-minute version. And then the film got some releases on some of the gray market and public domain labels on tape, also seemingly film transfers of the 68-minute US release version. The interesting outlier is, of course, the Japanese Laserdisc I have here, which is a double feature set with the Magnificent Ambersons. This is a rough print transfer of the European version. It's got hard-coded Japanese subtitles, and the transfer is what it is, but it does have the alternative European version with the different opening credits and the different ending and the unique materials, and it has the original English mono on an analog presentation. So the audio quality is limited, but it's actually the best quality we have for the European version, as the only other release is the Spanish PAL DVD, seemingly of the same transfer, as it appears pretty close to the picture quality of this Japanese version, just without the hard-coded subtitles and in a digital presentation. The problem is the Spanish DVD runs at PAL speed, so it runs 4% too fast, and the audio track, the mono mix that's on there, is hit with quite a lot of noise reduction, so it's lacking in fine detail, which is on the Laserdisc, even though the Laserdisc shows more damage in the audio track. So really, you have to try and match the audio of the Laserdisc to the picture of the DVD, but the Laserdisc is slightly time compressed and runs a bit fast, so on both of them you have to undo the speed up issues and then try to combine them and convert them into a standard format. The US release version finally got an official release and master by Turner on the Image Laserdisc, and then there was a very short-lived VHS release of the same master as part of the RKO collection line. Both of these came and went very quickly. They seemingly did not go through many print runs, and the Laserdisc is uncommon, but the VHS is even rarer. But those were the only physical media releases for the film here, and it stayed that way until 2024 with the Warner Archive Blu-ray release, also only of the US 68-minute theatrical release version. And so in the interim, the only way you could see the film was on television broadcast, usually on TCM, and they would be showing the Laserdisc master. Now, this master was actually released on DVD, but sadly only in Region 2 as another PAL DVD with, of course, PAL speed up, so it runs 4% fast. For some unknown reason, the film never got an official release on DVD by Warner Brothers, even during the DVD heyday. But then again, neither did the Magnificent Ambersons. That wouldn't get its bare-bones DVD until Citizen Kane arrived on Blu-ray, and Ambersons itself was treated as an afterthought and just given a bare-bones DVD that itself had a compromised audio track. So you would think that somebody could have made a Mercury Films and RKO box set with Kane, Ambersons, and Journey into Fear during the DVD boom, but films unfortunately require people to not just know the studio library, but actually to sell them within the studio in terms of the marketing departments and getting everybody on board to actually put money into restoring and reissuing a film. But unfortunately, Journey into Fear was basically unavailable from 1991 to 2024, and that big of a gap means that it has become a sad footnote in the Orson Welles story and the Mercury Group story and also Norman Foster's career. So with the Warner Archive Blu-ray, we finally have the film in print again. It's in circulation. The 4K preservation scan that was done for this Blu-ray release is sensational. It's really as good as it can be in terms of presenting the US compromised release version. It does highlight the patchwork quality of the picture and sound, but it is a stunning transfer, and again, it's as good as it could be. The only issue, it's only of the US release version. There is no inclusion of the European edition of the earlier edit in any form. There are no supplemental features about the film whatsoever. It is pretty much a bare bones disc. And so thankfully, we now have Mark Edlitz's book as the badly needed supplemental material for this film that has been kicked around ever since its original production. Now I'd like to talk about the physical book edition itself. This is available as a lovely print-on-demand paperback edition. There is a hardcover edition that is coming as well, and I presume this might eventually make it to an ebook version at some point later on. The cover is using one of the studio publicity shots of Welles looking very pensive, and it's got this really nice design aesthetic that goes for black, white, gray, and yellow, which actually manages to convey the feeling of the production going off the rails and the battles that indeed took place. So the title is really appropriate, and I love the primary title of Maverick and the Machine, which fits beautifully. Now, of course, this copy is stamped not for sale. It's a basically a proof copy, and that's because I did assist in the making of this book, at least to some small degree, with sourcing some of the stills and images from the film. So I was very happy to do so, and so that's why my copy has the not for resale across it. Of course, the standard copies you order will not have this blurb on the cover. We have the nice cover design carry over onto the spine and the rear cover as well. So you do get at least some bit of a nice little wraparound effect, and the cover is completely uniform. The book is a nice oversized paperback. It's a little bit smaller in dimensions compared to some of Edlitz's other previous books, particularly his Lost Adventures of James Bond, which was another oversized paperback, but it was a bit taller, a bit bulkier. This is a little bit easier to hold in your hands, but it is by no means a slimmer book, as this is still, it's about, I think it's about 265 pages in terms of the page count, and unlike some of his other books, it is entirely focused on a single film. So this is laser focused on Journey into Fear, but also giving the requisite background on the novel, the development, the various players involved, and where it comes in the Orson Welles and RKO story. The text and the margins and everything is nicely laid out. The book opens with a preface explaining why the film holds such fascination and inspires you to think about it, so much so that Edlitz himself felt compelled to write an entire book about it. Then we get an introduction which sets the stage for not just what the book's aims are, but it sets up the story you're about to experience, because the whole history of Journey into Fear is a story and a movie in and of itself. Part 1 is entitled The Journey Begins, which is about the development of the project from the acquiring the rights to the novel to the early attempts by Ben Hecht to adapt it, and then how it got to RKO and eventually how it got to the Mercury Group and Orson Welles. Part 2 is entirely about the development of the project from the acquiring of the rights and getting it from Ben Hecht, and then what RKO did with it, the early writers, the early treatments and scenarios, Welles coming into the picture, and the development of the screenplay. There are a number of famous names in terms of the world of RKO, and most notably for me, it actually highlights how Ardell Ray at one point was involved and had read the book. And she, of course, was the fantastic writer of several of the masterpiece Val Lewton horror films made in the wake of the Mercury unit being basically removed from the RKO premises. I should also mention the book is filled with wonderfully reproduced images of the various people being discussed. Of course, figures from the pre-production period. It's got fantastic production images and things that we have not really seen before from various collections. And of course, there's also a lot of images from the film itself. Part 3 is entirely about the pre-production of the film after the acquiring of the rights and getting the ball rolling. And then we move into Part 4, which is the full account of the actual production, going in chronological order, date by date, giving at some points an actual accounting of each individual day of shooting and production, and again interspersed with nicely reproduced stills. Fittingly, there's an image of Orson Welles in costume and director Norman Foster being so exhausted that they literally take a nap between camera setups. Part 5 is the post-production, and this is where things really go into overdrive. This is the meaty section that gets into the nitty-gritty of how things just went completely off the rails and the film wound up being pulled in so many different directions. Here is the inclusion of some of the original comment cards from that first test screening, highlighting that there were both positive and negative responses and actually quoting a lot of those, and then giving you the percentage of how many were positive and negative. This is just priceless right here. And then it's talking about the aftermath and how the studio reacted and how this began the series of re-edits and reshoots and retakes and redubs and re-edits of the re-edits and re-edits of those re-edits and so on and so forth. So this is the meat of the story, and this is where you can finally set to rest a lot of the myths that have surrounded the film and actually finally understand how it went from the 100-minute preview version to the bafflingly re-edited 68-minute release version. And again, there are some fantastic images from both versions of the film. And if you notice a certain polo shirt wearing film nerd's name mentioned in the book, and that's because I did assist in getting a number of the stills and images for this book. And I did this simply because I wanted to help, and this is such an important project, and this is a film I've been fascinated with, and these are questions I've had for years and could never answer, but I just didn't expect to see my name pop up for all of them, so that was an incredible thrill, I have to admit, when I was reading along. This continues in chronological order with the flow of events, going through the attempts at reshoots, what Mercury wanted to do, what Foster wanted to do, what Welles wanted to do, and what the studio was willing to do, which was not all that much. And then there were continual breakdowns between the parties in terms of communication and the studio not wanting to be bothered, and there was lots of back and forth, and there were additional previews. And here once again we have listings of the positive and negative reactions to the May 1942 preview version. You go further along and we're already later into the year 1942, and there have been additional versions and Welles attempting to fix what he could, and more back and forth and more changes and more versions made, and again highlighting some of the elements that wound up in the what is called the European cut, but is indeed one of these earlier edits of the film. So this section runs to the film's eventual release in January and February of 1943. Then the next section is the overall release pattern, the critical reception, and this also goes for Great Britain and the rest of Europe, and it really has some incredible information about the actual releasing pattern of the film, all the various films it was double billed with, what their box office takes were, and what the film's overall profits were, or what its profit margin was considered as. There's even some reproductions of some of the original city advertisements for the various programs and double bills Journey into Fear was paired in. Part 7 is really critical, as this is the comparison of the US 68-minute release version and the supposed European cut, aka one of the earlier edits of the film. So this goes through element by element and does a complete breakdown of all the major changes, from scenes being moved around to elements being removed, starting of course with the opening of the film, which features an entirely different credit sequence in the earlier edit that credits Welles as the co-writer of the screenplay and has a different card for the actual cast in terms of how Welles himself is credited as actor. The European version also opens with a map showing the location of Istanbul to better acquaint audiences of the time who might not have been aware of foreign geography or where exactly the story was being set. It, of course, also does not open with the striking scene introducing the assassin Banat that was used as a pre-credit sequence in the US version. So as I said, this goes through item by item with visual references as well of both the US and the European cut of the film. This really allows you to understand the changes that were made over time and how the US theatrical version is clearly building off of what this earlier edit had already done and making changes to that. So you could say that the version that was released in Europe, that's this alternate edit, is basically a pre-release edit or a pre-release version of the eventual theatrical film. It's similar, as I've said before, to the preview cut of Touch of Evil, but it's also similar to things like the rediscovered pre-release 1945 version of The Big Sleep that had additional material that was cut out of the famous 1946 theatrical release version of The Big Sleep, but the 1946 version had the famously reshot and rewritten scenes of Lauren Bacall with Humphrey Bogart to beef up her character and her overall presence in the film, which fundamentally altered certain sections of that film. So that's another worthwhile comparison in terms of having two mostly similar but also in ways completely different edits of the same film that have footage unique to both editions. And then crucially, there is discussion of the different endings, not just the ones in each of the cuts, but all the endings that Edlitz has been able to discover that were worked on or possibly shot or theorized or attempted. So there are not just two, one for each cut. There's not just three, the one that they maybe wanted to do and didn't get to do, but Edlitz has identified 7. There are 7 endings that were either considered, shot, put on a version of the film, and 2 of those we have surviving, one of which is the ending that Foster and Welles and the production came up with and is on the US release version, and this was done as a reshoot. The other is the attempt at salvaging an ending out of the climactic scene that doesn't quite work, and that's what's on the so-called European cut of the film. But Edlitz then talks about another 5 endings, and this is crucial to understanding the different things they were trying or tried to do, or may have even done and completed that we will just never see. And then he also highlights some of the retakes, which are clearly obvious in both versions of the film because the footage and the setups and everything will change or be altered in a particular scene. You don't always have to look closely because in some places it can be quite obvious that this is actually a retake. Some of them are artfully disguised, but in the US release cut, they're not often always disguised all that well. Part 8 is setting the record straight about Norman Foster actually being the director of Journey into Fear, but talking about the collaborative nature of the Mercury group and how Wells's fingerprints were all over everything, just like Norman Foster's fingerprints are all over everything. And Foster even helped rewrite the script, but Welles was the co-writer of the script with Joseph Cotten, and everyone was encouraged to pitch in where they could. So there's a bit of everyone's ideas in the melting pot of the film, and that's how it was supposed to be. But Norman Foster was the director, and this entire section is about debunking the myths that surround the film, because all of them were based on supposition or just making up stuff out of thin air, really. So this sets the record straight about the actual director of the film, what Wells's involvement actually was, and it sets the record straight about who wrote the screenplay and why Wells's credit was removed from the credits of the US release version. And there's actually a pretty straightforward answer why that happened. So this sets to rest a lot of myths about the film, and then also gives a nice biographical sketch about Foster himself. The book then closes out with a nice afterword and then has a number of extra appendix sections before going into the index and author's thank you section. The appendix sections are not something to simply gloss over because one of them, as I alluded to before, is a complete breakdown of every single shooting day, complete with images and full summarized notes about what happened each day, when the production had to shut down because somebody got sick, when they had to reschedule things because Welles had to go to Brazil, so they had to shoot all of his scenes much closer together, and how that meant the schedule had to be shuffled around. So this is an invaluable full production report. I mean, it is the day-to-day production report for each shooting day, and it's just been summarized and included here, giving you the day-by-day accounting of the entire production. Appendix B is a listing called The Many Journeys. This goes from the original novel to all of the adaptations it has seen in both film, television, and also radio as well. And then it gives a chronological listing of the different dates of the test screenings, when head of RKO George Safer saw the first version of the film, all the test versions and preview versions, and everything about the then general release and then television broadcasts as well. But it's not just a listing of the other adaptations. Each one of them gets a little bit of noting in terms of who made it, when it was made, and how it adapts the original source material. It then closes out with a complete listing of the cast and crew, and then the author's thank you notes before going into the bibliography and index. This book is, simply put, the finest and most important piece of Welles scholarship that has been for at least a certain number of years. This is one of the invaluable books that every Welles fan needs on their shelf, and it's one of the best books devoted to the making of a single film, especially such an unbelievably troubled and compromised film. This is one of the best film books, period. This is essential reading if you're at all interested in how films are made and unmade, or the history of troubled films, or if you're a fan of Citizen Kane and you want to know more about Welles and the Mercury Group and the other two films, or if you're a Welles fan and you've read every biography and you know about Journey into Fear, or even if you're just generally curious. This is an astounding read. You'll get sucked into it, and it's so easily digestible that you can pick up this book and get the whole story and experience and understand everything without ever having seen the film. I would hope you would at least watch the film once before you read the book to get the full experience, but Edlitz has so clearly laid out the whole case history of the film, blow by blow, day by day, month by month, year by year, that you can follow along. And because he's done all the detective work that we've needed for this film for so many decades, it finally is able to come out from the shadow of the urban legends and myths that surrounded it. It is no longer going to be considered a footnote in the Orson Welles story. People can finally stop misappropriating the directing and writing credits, because now the detective work has been done and we have this incredible book from Mark Edlitz. I have truly enjoyed his past books, particularly his James Bond ones, which are invaluable treasures, but I think this is his best book yet, because it is about a singular subject that has so badly needed this level of detective work and putting all the puzzle pieces together, because no one has ever done this before, and it's been a footnote in the Orson Welles story for far too long. Maverick and the Machine is truly the third volume companion piece to the legendary Robert Carringer books on Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons. It's the third book we have always needed on the third Mercury film, which has not existed until now. It's also the essential companion piece to the sadly rather bare bones but still incredibly essential Warner Archive Blu-ray. So if you have the Archive Blu-ray, you really need Maverick and the Machine for the whole story, and if you have Maverick and the Machine, you really need the Warner Archive Blu-ray to have the highest quality version of the US release edit of the film. Either way, they are so essential that you really have to have both to understand the full experience of what was the third Mercury film, what it became, and how badly it was compromised and torn apart and put back together so many times. The film still needs a proper restoration of both cuts included on a deluxe physical media release, or at the very least, the so-called European version needs a proper modern restoration and preservation of those elements for all time. But at this point, I'm so ecstatic that there's finally now a book that lays to rest all of the myths and misconceptions surrounding Journey into Fear. I hope this will make the film better known and get more people interested into learning the history of this film. And I hope, along with the archive Blu-ray, it means that more people will even hear of Journey into Fear and see this film, because it's one of those incredible puzzles that film fans encounter in terms of enormously troubled films that had productions that were not just troubled, but release versions that were not the original intended version. And when film fans stumble across these, they're usually in late night television airings, and you become fascinated with what you're watching because you can tell something's not quite right, and you can see flashes of greatness, or you can see flashes of things that work, and it makes you curious and you start digging, but there's not a lot of information and there's no physical media release you can get your hands on, and it starts you on this path. And so it's really touching in a way to see that Mark Edlitz did the same thing I did and what a lot of other Welles fans have done of becoming fascinated with this film. First, having to get access to this film because that was difficult, and then returning to it over the years, trying to find out more of its secrets and reading every Welles book and only getting so much information, but that only gets you so far. And then when you first discover the alternative European version and you see what that's like, and instead of solving problems, it actually compounds problems and is even more mysterious. So then you have to wonder, what was the genesis of that version? All the mysteries about Journey into Fear, any long-held questions you have ever had about this film, about the last of the 3 Mercury films made at RKO, all of those are answered in Maverick and the Machine. It is an invaluable treasure. It is one of the best film books there is. It belongs on any film fan's bookshelf. It is a handsomely produced volume. It is relatively inexpensive, and it will keep you riveted because this is a great story that always needed to be told, and now we can finally experience that story and understand how this little film got so unbelievably manipulated and butchered and put back together and torn apart and then put back together time and time again to become the 68-minute release version that was used to really be the final nail in the coffin of Mercury and Orson Welles at RKO. And sadly, this became part of the Orson Welles story that followed him around for the rest of his career, and all of the preconceived notions that other people had when he first came to Hollywood, and the opinions and actions of various studio individuals basically colored people's perception of Welles for the rest of his career. It was something he never truly escaped from. And that's really where a lot of the myths about Welles first sprung up. And I think getting this direct accounting of exactly what happened and seeing behind the curtain to the day-to-day production activities and how hard Welles and Foster and everyone involved fought to try and keep hold of the film that they had made, even with everything else falling apart and the It's All True documentary film falling apart. They still tried, and it makes the overall film experience more heartbreaking because now we know the full story, and it reveals that Journey into Fear in its own way was as badly hacked apart and manipulated and butchered as the Magnificent Ambersons was. And I hope that people will read this book along with watching the film and understand that there were indeed 3 films that Orson Welles and the Mercury unit made at RKO, that it's not just Citizen Kane and it's not just the Magnificent Ambersons, and that at one point, they made a really good thriller, an adaptation of a classic Eric Ambler novel that was a bit edgy, a bit out there, a bit different, a bit funny, but incredibly suspenseful, incredibly well made, and should have been a commercial success, but it was unfortunately never to be because other entities involved themselves, and we never got to see the film that they were actually making. So this book gets my absolute highest of highest recommendations. It is essential. It's a phenomenal book of film scholarship. It's one of the best books about Welles that you can pick up and read. It is the worthy successor to the 2 famous Robert Carringer volumes on Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons, and simply put, it's one of the best film books ever written because it is absolutely getting into the nitty-gritty of every detail about a single film and how it was brought together, how it was made, and how it was ultimately torn apart and destroyed, leaving only two extremely compromised, completely different edits based on the studio's own tomfoolery. So if you're at all interested in reading this book, I will have links in the description below to where you can get a copy. It is primarily sold through Amazon as it's an independent work, but I'll also have links to Mark Edlitz's social media pages where you can also get more information about his other invaluable works of film scholarship and books about various forms of lost media. As always, I hope my babblings about the works of Orson Welles, the Mercury unit at RKO, and film books has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I've been fascinated by Journey into Fear ever since I first got to see it as a kid. It was a very difficult film to see, and I've never lost that fascination for it. Every time I return to it, I dive into the mystery again, and I always hit brick walls because there's just only so much information out there. It's the same stuff that gets repeated, and then you see the various legends about the film get recirculated. So this book answers all the questions I was dying to have answered and thought never would be. And it goes even beyond that. It exceeded even my expectations, which I knew it was going to be a great book considering what Edlitz has done before with his past works. But again, I think of his film books so far, I do think this is his most important work to date, as it truly answers decades worth of mysteries. I'd like to conclude by saying, please do keep supporting the incredible efforts of our film scholars and historians by purchasing and supporting all of their incredible film studies books, whether they're officially published or done by a university press or independently published. All of them are helping to preserve not just film history, but our own film culture. So keep reading film books, and thank you ever so much for watching.